On January 30th, 1933, German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler to the post of Chancellor of the German Reich. In response, Erich Ludendorff, the First World War general and former Hitler collaborator, castigated his old friend President Hindenburg, saying, quote, "You have delivered up our holy German fatherland to one of the greatest demagogues of all time. I solemnly prophesy that this accursed man will cast our Reich into the abyss and bring our nation to inconceivable misery. Future generations will damn you in your grave for what you have done." Close quote. Historian Timothy Ryback, on his mesmerizing book, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Timothy Ryback is co-founder and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He has written on Weimar and Nazi Germany for the past 3 decades and interviewed many of the last living members of Hitler's private entourage. Ryback is author of Hitler's Private Library, which has appeared in more than 30 editions around the world, and most recently, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, about the last 6 months of the Weimar Republic. Since January of this year, he has written a series of pieces for The Atlantic, chronicling Hitler's disabling and subsequent dismantling of democratic structures and processes in the first months of 1933. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. It's great to be on your show.
Segment 1, The Rise of Adolf Hitler. In his review of Mein Kampf, George Orwell noted, quote, "Hitler knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also at least intermittently want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. Whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way has said to people, 'I offer you a good time,' Hitler has said to them, 'I offer you struggle, danger, and death.' And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet." So, Tim, somehow the son of a doting mother and an abusive customs official stepfather, a man who was a failed art student, a moody vagrant, a First World War veteran, and a rabid right-wing radical, became one of the world's most consequential figures. So before we discuss Hitler's final rise to power, can you give us a thumbnail as to who Adolf Hitler was before 1932, the year in which your book begins?
You know, it's interesting, Todd, when you look at Hitler's speeches in the summer and then into the autumn of 1932. And this is, what you need to keep in mind is there was a national election in July of 32. And that's when Hitler hit his high water mark in a free and open election with 37% of the electorate. The Germany was stunned and astonished. Even Hitler was, I think, stunned by this achievement, quote unquote achievement. And when you look at his speeches, what he says there repeatedly is, "We began in 1919 with 7 men sitting around the back room in a Munich beer hall. And here we are, just over a decade later, the most powerful political movement in the world." And so if you want to ask me who Hitler was in 1932, Hitler was someone who really was, as you said, a failed artist, a vagrant for a while, somebody who was living on the fringe of Munich life, but then even the political life in Germany, who within just over a decade became one of the most powerful political figures in the country. And I think Hitler himself was astonished by what he had achieved and what his movement had achieved over that time. What attributed to that, Hitler attributed to divine providence. He was the higher powers were leading him on. What I think it was a blindness to anything but the mission that he was pursuing. And he never accepted defeat. He would be slapped down. He was imprisoned. The movement was bankrupt. One setback after another, and he simply kept moving forward. And I think it was this fierce, blinding determination on his part, with, as the British historian Ian Kershaw once said, when he wrote 1,600 pages, this iconic, biography of Adolf Hitler. And at the end of the day, what he attributed it to was Hitler had the luck of the devil. And he really did. I mean, when you watch time and again, there's so many occasions on which Hitler should have failed. Assassination, over 25 assassination attempts in the course of that. And he came out of all of these unscathed. It's a somewhat circuitous route, but who was he? I think in the summer, by 1932, on the cusp of power, he was a man who was a nobody who came from nowhere, backwoods Austria, who suddenly found himself positioned on the cusp of political power.
It is an incredible, a dark story, but it's incredible in terms of it's unbelievable, as you said, to see all the different ways that he could have been pushed off the scene, or he could have collapsed under his own, weaknesses or foibles or eccentricities or evils or what have you. And yet he kept on going. I keep, when I was giving talks to a number of people in various venues on Hitler, one of the things I always kind of noted was what he tried to do violently in 1923 in the Beer Hall Putsch, he did technically legally in the democratic process in 1933, 10 years later. And like you said, for all intents and purposes, he should have been dead in the water after that violent Beer Hall Putsch, although there was a lot of popularity in the Bavarian area simply because there was just a big strain towards his political perspective. The other thing I was going to say is, I think it's Raymond Aron who once dubbed the notion of secular religions. As you've said, he invoked, especially when he's the assassination attempt on him in July of 1944, he again credits, if I'm not mistaken, he credits God for having delivered him. Once again, he's been spared to deliver the Reich and so on and so forth by the hand of God and so on and so forth. Just briefly, can you say a little bit more on his sense of this almost religiosity of his of the providence that was buoying him up, that he discerned as buoying him up, or the religiosity of his movement?
Yeah, so, for this, Hitler's word for this was Vorsehung, which was providence. Not God per se. This is not God with a big white beard sitting on a cloud, or, with St. Peter standing before the pearly gates. I actually do have an answer for this somewhat. I'll get to this, but
sure.
When I was doing research for Hitler's private library, I was looking at various collections. The largest one, about 1,200 volumes, is in the rare book room of the Library of Congress, under the euphemistic title, the Third Reich collection. But what this was, these were some of Hitler's most personal books. The earliest one dating from, I think it's November 1916.
Wow.
This is when he's a 26-year-old corporal in the trenches in northern France, and he buys a copy of it's a architectural guide to Berlin, and on the inside cover it says, it's just Adolf Hitler with the location, which is the town of Führer, and then the date. You open up the pages, there is still trench dirt between the pages. There's paraffin wax, red paraffin wax dripped on the pages, where he must have been reading by candlelight in the bunker. So we have, and these are books this is a book that Hitler, when he was an absolute nobody, a corporal on the front lines, that he kept with him his entire life. And so we have this collection of books, but what surprised me were the number of books related to religious issues, to the occult, to the mystical. There's a copy of Nostradamus in there, on and on and on. I then go to continue research, and the second largest collection is at Brown University in the Rare Book Room there. They have about 80 volumes. Once again, books on the spiritual, the occult, paranormal phenomena, and many of them with marginalia, and several other locations. So I was coming across all these books on these issues, and it turned out that Traudl Junge was still alive. Now, who is Traudl Junge? She was Hitler's private secretary during the last 18 months of his life, and right before Hitler committed suicide in the spring of 1945 in the bunker, he had a final lunch, and there were 4 people at the lunch table. There was Adolf Hitler, there was Eva Braun, who he had just married to make his wife, so she was Frau Hitler. There was one secretary, and then there was Traudl Junge. So she is literally one of the last living people to have been with Hitler just before his suicide, but more importantly, as his private secretary, had spent almost every day with him in the final 18 months of his life. And I'd made photocopies of a lot of this material and taken it to her, and she confirmed a couple of things for me that I found interesting. One was I've heard testimonials from various people saying that Hitler was a voracious reader. He claimed to have read a book every night of his adult life. Leni Riefenstahl, the filmmaker, once said that Hitler told her, when a person gives, they have to take, and I take what I need from books. So, Hitler was a voracious reader, book a night for most of his adult life. Personally, I think he had intellectual insecurities, and he'd never finished graduating the equivalent of high school, and I think there was this need to compensate for this lack. But then I got to the point of these books on religious issues, spiritual issues, the occult, and I asked Traudl Junge to explain that to me. And she said, without question, this was an issue that preoccupied him. In fact, you mentioned the 1944 assassination attempt, the famous one where he was in a military meeting. There was a suitcase loaded with dynamite that Stauffenberg put next to him. It explodes. The room gets blown apart, and Hitler walks out, his uniform smoldering, but having survived this. And Traudl Junge was one of the first people to see him after this, and she remembered the smoke coming off his uniform.
Wow.
And he did say this to her, which was, this is a sign. This is Vorsehung. Providence has saved me, to lead Germany on. So then, I got talking with her about, exactly what Hitler's belief system was. And as we know, he was raised as a strict Roman Catholic, had spent time in a monastery, I think, for 2 years. What I believe personally is that, unlike Stalin, who was just an atheist, or Marx or Lenin, Hitler was raised as a Roman Catholic. He had the architecture of Catholicism built within him, so that even when he had cast off the faith, though he never actually left the church, but the belief system he'd grown up with, I do not believe he continued to have, but the need to believe, that inner architecture of the structures for belief were there, and he was looking for something to fill that inner space. And when when I was discussing this with Jung, I said, I showed her these various books, all this marginalia, and she said that once again, Hitler did not necessarily believe in a Trinity, in a God with a beard sitting on a cloud, but that she said he believed in a greater force, a divine force that shaped and moved the world, possibly embedded in natural laws, the laws of physics, the very fact that there is an order to this world. She thought that he took as a sign that there was a higher power guiding us, shaping our world, and in particular protecting him for this quote unquote holy mission of National Socialism, quote unquote, right? But then she paused, and so she said to me, she paused and she says, yes. So I pushed her. I said, so Hitler, you think Hitler did believe? And she said, yes. I believe, based on my experience with him, that this was a man who did believe in a higher power. But then she paused and said something very important. But how can any of us ever know what another person really believes or doesn't? And I think, this is someone who, to my mind, has come as close to touching on one of the essential facts of Hitler, of anyone. And what I appreciate about it was, this was not somebody who was making an argument to make a point. She was providing the observations that she had, her own conclusions, but ultimately took one step back and said, I cannot say what another person believes or doesn't believe. That's really for them, even if it is Adolf Hitler.
We're gonna dive in our third segment on the person of Hitler. So this is fascinating. We'll leap off from this in a little bit, but I want to ask you. I think many people out there are wondering, and I'm wondering this too. What was it like to sit with somebody who knew Hitler so well? I mean, was that, as a historian, it must have been, and of course she was older, much older, and I think she has a documentary called Blind Spot that's out there, if I'm not mistaken, where she's relaying. It's very conversational. It's like almost like a 1 hour, 80-minute interview or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Absolutely, it's brilliant. It's called Blindside, yes.
Blindside.
And what the filmmaker did, I was actually interviewing her during this time, meaning in between the work she was doing, but she'd been pretty silent on all of this, and then began opening up. I believe I was the only journalist who actually interviewed her during this time period. She was dying of cancer at that time and passed away about 6 months later. But with Blindside, what this filmmaker did was to interview Traudl Junge on her memoirs, on her memories of this. And she had written memoirs, but then this is, what she was remembering. And he then paused and came back to her, maybe whether it's a couple months or a year later, and he showed her herself remembering the times with Hitler, and then filmed her watching herself. And what you see is how horrified she was by the way she was remembering him. Wow. And this is the same thing. When I went to her, she just started on these stories about, up at the Berghof, when he was called Der Chef, but, when Hitler, was away, or Hermann Göring was away, they would, run up the hill to Hermann Göring's house and swim in his swimming pool. And these are a bunch of young people, a bunch of perfect Aryans, but just having fun and frolicking up on the Obersalzberg, where this nightmare of the Third Reich was conceived. Which brings me, to your question. I have to say, so you're sitting this. I've interviewed, many of Hitler's closest entourage, the survivors, and as a historian, you're fascinated. You're going, oh my God, this is as close as you're going to get to real history.
Yeah.
But then you pause as you're walking away, and you said, who did I just spend 3 hours with?
Yeah.
Who was I talking to like this? Because you can call it blindside, but because maybe you didn't know everything about the Holocaust, but I'm sorry, you know who Adolf Hitler was. You know about the anti-Semitism. You know about the military incursions. You know about the ruthless barbarity of the war that he was conducting. The whole world knew. And I have to say, I always thought of this, there's almost this, as there is with radiation, there's a half-life on it. Well, there's a half-life on this historical toxicity. The farther you get away from the moment, somehow the less toxic these people become, and the more interesting they become. And almost from a clinical historical perspective, it's important for us to capture as much of this as possible to truly understand what was going on. It's and as I say, and I think the importance of this, and importance of like looking at Hitler's private library, which was show me someone's library and I'll show you the man. The person, we're revealed by the books that we keep, those that we read, those that we don't. But I think if you simply leave Hitler as this icon of absolute horror and evil without trying to understand the human being behind it, it actually becomes more dangerous, because it's easier to write it off and say, oh my God, this is the devil incarnate. This is evil incarnate. There's never been anything like this before, without understanding that this was a human being who committed these atrocities, and that there was human motivation behind it.
This is the string of narrative throughout this book, Takeover, which I think is so good because it really renders. I mean, it does not diminish the evil, the malevolence of behind the ideology, Hitler's ideology, Hitler himself, but it shows the very human machinations, the politics and the horse trading and the risks that were being taken and risks that were rewarded and so on and so forth. I mean, very much what you're going to say. And again, we'll get into this in a third segment on the person of Hitler. There's a very Solzhenitsyn wisdom that comes out of what you're saying. The line separating good and evil lies, not between nations and states and even between people, but within every human being. It divides the human heart. And that's the mystery of what it is, that how can a human being ever bow down to do something or stoop down to do something so evil. And this is a little bit of, George Kennan once made a reference to the notion that beware the inner totalitarian in every one of us. So it's, I think your, if you will, like you said, clinical appreciation of the kind of person Hitler was, the kind of people Hitler's followers were, it isn't to excuse them in their humanity. It's to menace us with the notion that human beings did this stuff. And let's beware lest we say, oh, we can easily mark this person as, that person's a monster and that's easily diagnosed and so on. It could never happen again, et cetera. So is that a fair assessment of kind of boiling down what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yes, Todd. Yes.
So in 1922, German scholar Kurt Hess wrote, quote, "Where he comes from, no one can say. From a prince's palace, perhaps, or a day laborer's cottage, but everyone knows. He is the Führer. Everyone cheers him, and thus he will one day announce himself, he for whom all of us are waiting, full of longing, who feel Germans' present distress deep in our hearts, so that thousands and hundreds of thousands of brains picture him, millions of voices call for him, one single German soul seeks him." Close quote. Again, this was said in 1922. Ideas of the folk, of blood and soil, and the Führer populated many German minds during the post-World War I privations and the fledgling Weimar Republic instability. So, Tim, we talked about who Hitler was before 1932. Tell us a few words about the Weimar Republic, this fertile ground of political dysfunctionality from which Adolf Hitler sprang.
Yeah, this fertile ground of political dysfunctionality is perfect, and there's probably been no democracy that's ever come into being come into existence with more burdens and complexities attached to it. The operative trauma for the Weimar Republic was the Treaty of Versailles. And this was, this is what ended the Second World War and burdened Germany. What you have to keep in mind is in November of 1918, there was an armistice. The war had ended. Both sides agreed to lay down their arms. Okay, that was the understanding. It wasn't until the Germans got to Versailles, to the peace treaty, to find out that they were actually going to be accused of everything and to have to bear the burden of this. And there was this famous war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles that made Germany responsible for all the horrors of the First World War. And this is what the Weimar Republic, this was the dark stain on the soul of the Republic, as it were, that it carried with it, which was the Germans not only had they lost the war, but they were burdened with which has subsequently been seen, an unfair responsibility for the entire guilt of the war. And on top of that, they had to pay this onerous burden of these billions of marks in reparation payments to compensate for it. So you had not only the defeat, you had this sense of this unfair blame, and on top of that, the economic burdens of paying off this debt. And the democracy struggled as well as it could, and it actually did manage to move forward. There was a big crisis in 1923. This is the famous moment of hyperinflation when people we've seen the photos of people with wheelbarrows full of money to go buy a loaf of bread. Well, and that's also when Hitler launched his coup. This was his, the attempted beer hall putsch that failed. But then the Republic started into actually a gradual recovery mode, and the economy began to stabilize. The political situation stabilized, and then it was hit again with the crash of 1929, which hit the entire world. And there's that famous phrase, when America sneezes, Europe catches pneumonia, and it was the impact of this was massive. And that's when you actually saw the National Socialist movement rise. This was in September of 1930. There was an election where the National Socialists had 12 seats in the 600-seat Reichstag to over 100. So they rose tenfold in a single election. And this was people just desperate for a solution.
Right.
Now, how Hitler, that's the overall thing. So this is a country, a fledgling democracy struggling with these issues of the war guilt, of the economic burdens, and everything else that goes along with complex democracies, with left-wing politics, with right-wing politics. You have to keep in mind, you also had this shadow of Marxism. We had the Bolshevik Revolution, and the whole idea was that this was a revolution that was going to take over the world. And it was, what we know is sort of the domino theory, one country after another. In Bavaria, right after the war, this spring of 1919, there was actually a Marxist putsch, a Bolshevik putsch there, and they established the Soviet Republic of Bavaria. And this is in Europe. Now, very short-lived. It was then crushed by, it was a left-wing movement that was then crushed by, a right-wing movement. But you had this, this country torn back and forth by these. But Hitler, through all of this, Hitler's drumbeat, and this was already in 1922, that quote you gave, and keeping in mind, this is when he was actually a pretty marginal figure. So this is before the beer hall putsch even. But Hitler's drumbeat was the Treaty of Versailles, the reparation payments, and of course he blamed this on a Jewish conspiracy writ large, and blaming democracy writ large for all of these sins, because it was the politicians of the Weimar Republic who signed the Treaty of Versailles and brought all of this on the country. It was the Social Democrats, the leftists, who stabbed the politicians at home, who stabbed the German soldiers in the back, that basically surrendered, even though the German soldiers were willing to fight on. This is all a myth, of course, but Hitler used a couple of these tropes again and again and again, and it runs consistently through. So it was really a politics of vengeance that he kept this drumbeat through, 12 years until the spring of 1932, summer of 1932, when they reached their high water mark of 37%.
What's amazing too, as you describe this and describe it so well, it seems that history has shown that when the economy settles down, people kind of return to more moderate parties. They elect more moderate leaders and so on. When the economy goes into the tank, all of a sudden the more radical people reach for into the radical bags, if you will, and the communists do well, or the Nazis start to do well, and so on. One of the features that many people didn't recognize that after all the reading I've done over the years, it came really apparent in Takeover, your book, was the presence of the paramilitaries of these radical parties. So what many might not know is that, and you describe this in your book, the Versailles Treaty limited the official German Wehrmacht, or the German army, to I think 100,000 and no more than 100,000 members of the military across the nation. Whereas the radical parties, the communists, the National Socialists, I think the Conservative Center Party, not so radical, but Conservative Center Party, they had their own paramilitaries. So you had the SA, which is the brown shirts with the Nazis. You had the Red Front, which was with the communists. You had the steel helmets with the Conservative Center Party, that were not just small groups of toughs that went out and beat people up in the street, although they did do that, but these became massive numbers that outnumbered even the military, the official military, and the police. So I'm just wanting to ask you, as we move over to our second segment in a second, what was the role of these? How did these paramilitaries that were just burgeoning in the midst of this instability, what kind of pressures were they placing on where things are going to go in Germany?
Well, you make a really important point, Todd, which was, and once again, this is another sin of the Treaty of Versailles, quote unquote sin, is that the German military was restricted to 100,000 soldiers. There was great instability in the country. There really was a Bolshevik threat in the country. And what the government allowed to happen were to form these paramilitaries around each of the major political parties. There were ways of sifting arms out of military casernes into the hands of these groups. So there was, and the government in some ways relied on them for a certain, level of stability or backup in case there was, let's say, a Bolshevik revolution. And so you had a very, plus on top of that, let me say, these units, these paramilitaries were fueled by the millions of veterans that you had from the First World War. I mean, these were battle-hardened soldiers who knew how to fight. And they all went into their particular, political constellation, so that every single one of these groups did have the capacity to fight. The government sided with some of them quietly more than others, but it was a highly volatile and a highly, as you said, militarized society, in that way. That did provide a sense of particular stability. Something interesting here was that in December of 1932, so right before Hitler came to power, there was, along with the rise of the Nazis on the far right, there you had the rise of the Communist Party on the far left, and the center was falling away. And it comes back to economics, as you said. The centrist parties, the centrist politics, were failing the average worker, and they were desperate for a solution, and you either looked far left or far right. The interesting thing, even in voting patterns, is that if somebody was a communist, they were more likely, if they were to switch parties, to become a National Socialist.
Yeah.
It isn't like they moved to the center, they moved from one extreme to the other, because people were looking for a solution. And in December of 1932, when there was a fear of destabilization, that there was something called the Ott Report, which was if the communists attempted to launch a coup, the Nazis party would go to war with them. The German military would be forced to intervene to maintain the stability of the country. Poland, which was laying claim to certain German territories, would then invade Germany, taking advantage of this, and the entire country would collapse. So this was this sense of a society, of a country without the normal guardrails that we have in a stable democracy. So by the end of 1932, there was a lot of concern about something on the far right, something on the far left, the collapse of the center.
Segment 2. Hitler and the Fragility of Democracy. The big joke on democracy, Joseph Goebbels wrote in 1928, is that it gives its mortal enemies the tools to its own destruction. And as the Nazis won their first seats in the Reichstag, Goebbels would spit, quote, "We entered the Reichstag to use the arsenal of democracy in order to assault it with its own weapons. We will become Reichstag delegates in order to paralyze the Weimar process with its own mechanisms," close quote. So, Tim, most people are familiar with American-style democracy. We have 3 branches of government with checks and balances, regular elections of presidents, senators, House of Representatives. We have appointments of justices and federal judges, and so on. Let's talk a little bit about German democracy in the Weimar Republic. Could you just give us a thumbnail on what is the Reichstag? How do they call elections? And then maybe a word or two on the role of the president, the chancellor, and the cabinet. How's that for a treatise on entire German political system in 3 minutes?
Okay. Let's start with the Reichstag, which is first of all, the Weimar Constitution was designed with a similar checks and balance system to that of the American Constitution. It was actually, the Weimar Constitution was, they brought in some of the leading constitutional scholars of the day in order to design this. So it was supposed to be the most modern constitution. It had the checks and balance system, which is you had your executive branch, you had your legislative branch, you had the judicial branch. The legislative branch, which was called the Reichstag, which is what we call our Congress. Okay, it's basically a body of 600 delegates who are elected to, represent their constituency in the Reichstag. You had a multi-party system, unlike the U.S. system where we basically have two parties or occasional. You had anyone who could get more than 60,000 people together basically could create their own ticket. So in some elections, you had as many as 30 parties in a single election. So what you ended up with was a very fragmented legislative body, which meant that percentages could matter, meaning a party with maybe only 10 or 12% could actually play an important role in getting through, getting you to the absolute majority of, the simple majority of 51%. So it was this constant politicking around, and most of the major parties had anywhere from 20 to 30% of the vote, and you had about five major parties there. Now, the big surprise came with the National Socialists when Hitler suddenly had 37%, the Nazis got 37% in the July 1932 election, making them the largest party, the most powerful political force in the country. Now, listen to Hitler's logic on the use of this, and this is where he was a fascist. They were, authoritarian, but they understood democracy as well as anyone. Hitler, and when Hitler got 37%, he went into the president. Actually, maybe full stop here. Okay, the three branches, the legislative branch I mentioned, right? Yep. You have the judicial branch, then you have the equivalent of the executive branch, which is the chancellor who runs the country, who runs the government, The president, by the Constitution, is elected by popular vote. This was Paul von Hindenburg, and he could appoint or dismiss a chancellor at will. Article 58 of the Constitution. So basically, if somebody could put a government together, get 51% of the vote in the Reichstag, that would give them the legitimacy to make claim to the chancellorship. And they would. Now, the problem was the political situation was so fragmented that people had a hard time cobbling together a government with 51% representation in the Reichstag. When Hitler got his 37%, he didn't want to cooperate with anyone. It was his way or no way. He goes to Hindenburg, and Hindenburg says, wait, first of all, I would never appoint you chancellor. He said, for the sake of God, my country, and my conscience, because he said, you are such a divisive, hate-filled figure that I would not want this. I want someone who can cooperate, who can unite the country, not divide it. Hitler's response, and listen to Hitler's math on this. Hitler said, 37% is 75% of 51%, meaning, and he said, therefore, I should be able to run the country. And this is it is, if you think about it, Hitler understood the dynamics of democracy, and what Hitler did, as soon as he had the relative majority of the simple majority, meaning even if he'd had 26%, he basically, the first people he went after were not his political enemies, they were his political allies. And he either co-opted, cudgeled, or crushed every other party on the right so that he could lay claim to the entire right-wing movement. And that's basically how he leveraged himself into power. But it was a very, I don't know if you want to call it nuanced understanding, but it was really understanding of how politics worked. And what they would do is this goes back to the Goebbels quote. In the Reichstag, when they had 37%, they were basically able to paralyze the legislative process through obstructionist voting, which ultimately then forced Hindenburg to run the country through executive decrees so that he basically turned into a constitutional dictatorship, even though Hindenburg was trying to get a functioning democracy going. The Nazis played obstructionist politics and played this in a very sophisticated, very nuanced way. And that's how I do that. The other thing I might mention here is a name that doesn't get mentioned much, and this is Alfred Hugenberg. And Hugenberg he had been an industrialist who then became a media mogul. And right after World War I, Hugenberg understood that the media, most of the mainstream press in Germany, was controlled by liberal, cosmopolitan people, the quote-unquote Jewish press, as the Nazis would say. But what Hugenberg set about doing was to create a media empire that represented right-wing perspectives. And he also he develops an approach called, and what the reason he wanted to do this was to give voice to the conservatives, as opposed to, in opposition to the open liberal press. But what Hugenberg also did was to flood the space with something that he called fabrications. And this was basically what we call fake news now. And one example of the fake news of the time, we know about the Treaty of Versailles. We know about these reparation payments. Well, one story that Hugenberg's network put out there was that the German government was enslaving German teenagers and selling them to the Allies in order to service the German war debts, which means, sending German kids off to Senegal, which was a French colony, sending them off to the British Empire. So it's a complete absurd invention, and yet you'll read half-page stories in the German press about German kids being enslaved, German teenagers being enslaved and sent off. Why Hugenberg did this was, to poison the public space, but what he also wanted to do was to polarize society. And what Hugenberg realized was, if you could get enough of this poison out there, and get very controversial issues out there, that you could polarize not only the political parties, not only communities, but even within families. And his theory was that democracy required consensus in order to function. It was trade-offs in the center. So Hugenberg's theory, he called it Katastrophenpolitik, or the politics of catastrophe, that what you would do is hollow out the political center and the democratic system would collapse on its own accord. And he became a major partner with Hitler in the first weeks of, in the first, 6-8 weeks of Hitler's chancellorship. Hugenberg played an absolutely central role, but in the lead up to that, for the decade that Hitler was out there conducting his rallies and spewing all this hatred and gathering people around his National Socialist movement, you had Hugenberg out there with a much larger project, which was hollowing out the center and waiting for the system to collapse on its own accord.
It's again back to this whole human nature side of things. The nuance and the tactical and strategic approaches of these parties. And like you've said, it's propaganda, it's divisiveness, it's certain military strut and throwing your weight around in intimidation. It's making, kind of funny math with, 37% is actually 75%. I mean, it's like a creative math child, a math student trying to argue a test question with the teacher to get credit or what have you. I mean, it really does get into all these different levers that are being, or opportunities to exploit weaknesses or gray areas or what have you within the existing and fragile Weimar democracy that seems to be tapped into by Hugenberg, by Hitler, and so on. The other thing we find in your story is, and we're going to go back to the scaffolding of these elections in 32 in just a second, but we see people like Fritz von Papen, we see Schleicher, there's a Kurt von Schleicher, there's a number of names that are popping up here, and you say these people are political players. They are operators. They are conniving this way and they're making promises that way, secret meetings, and then refusals to admit those meetings and so on. I mean, this is literally a political, I mean, if it weren't so dark in how it turns out, it's a political thriller of the first order to see what happens in 1932 going to 1933. Is it okay for me to call this work not only a great work of history, but a political thriller?
Well, for me, in researching it, it was a political thriller because what I did when I began writing this, it's a job of a historian to tell us how we got from where we were to where we are.
Yeah.
And what you generally do is then to look for those facts that help explain the course of events that lends these events with a sense of historical inevitability. So once you say, it's the rise and the fall of the Third Reich, we know where it began, we know where it ended. But what I did was to forget everything I knew. In writing Takeover, I read the daily newspapers, I read diaries, I read meeting protocols, but I only knew what was known at that moment and at that day. And suddenly the world looks a lot more complicated, a lot more confusing, but you also see a lot of other alternatives. And when you mention Schleicher and Papen and Strasser, you have all of these people playing on all of these potentialities and all these different routes that things could have taken. And what we also forget is that by the end of 1932, by December of 32, Hitler hit his high water mark with these July elections with 37%. There were follow-on elections in November in which he lost 2 million votes.
Yes.
The party was millions of marks in debt. It was actually fractured internally. And Hitler was actually, by the end of 1932, Hitler was being written off. My favorite comment about Hitler was that Hitler is a man with a great future behind him. So this is how he was seen at that point. And I think, it was a complex constellation of people. We tend to then, as we try to write the history to make sense of how we got here, we tend to leave a lot of these people and a lot of these stories or these other potential courses, just out of the picture.
Just so people know too, again, the book is fantastic. You have to read this. It is a page turner and it really unfolds, like you said, Tim, with the real time, if you will. You're in the present reading these newspapers. You're in the present in these secret meetings, kind of wondering what's going to happen next. Because many people don't know what this story is. How does Hitler go from high water mark in July to being written off in November to being chancellor in January of 33? And I just want to give people again the scaffolding, just so you know, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg, the famous World War I general who was 84-ish at that time. That was it. That was in a series of elections, like a runoff election. Then, two elections in March and April of 32. Hitler gets destroyed by like 6 million votes. In July of 32, late July of 32 is when the Reichstag elections occur, and the National Socialists win 13 million votes. As you've said, Tim, multiple times, 37% of the seats in the Reichstag. That's 230 seats out of 600. This was considered this great victory. And then Hitler is consistently saying, I want to be the chancellor. I want to be the chancellor. I want to be the chancellor. And the people that are surrounding Hindenburg and Hindenburg himself are consistently saying, no, but we'll give you this. No, but we'll give you that. And Hitler gambles to the dismay of some of his party members, including Gregor Strasser, who was one of the original Nazis who said, we've got to play the game a little bit. We got to be incrementalist a little bit. Don't leave stuff on the table. And he ended up splitting off a little bit. But Hitler kind of maintained its kind of all or nothing, all or nothing, all or nothing, until in November of 32, he ultimately, the party falls down and they're starting to be written off. Ultimately, 2 months later, for him to arrive at the very place he was striving to get to. Now, I wanted to give that because I have so many. There's so many questions. I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I wanted to ask you, this is a story of strategies and tactics, communications and miscommunications, hopes and fears, alliances and breakups, ideology, reality, power and money, and it's all packed into a very tight book. Tim, as you researched this singular and decisive year, 1932, were you surprised by the complexity of what unfolded and the role that chance and contingency played in tandem with plans and programs?
Absolutely, Todd. I was astonished. And once again, when you see what's actually going on in the press, when you see what the assessments are, who are considered the real power brokers, the really powerful figures, and where Hitler fits into this, when you look actually at the numbers of the bank accounts, and the absolute, by the end of 32, the National Socialist movement is bankrupt, politically, financially, and ideologically. It's split. On top of that, and this is what we forget, Hitler owed 400,000 Reichsmarks in back taxes for the sales of Mein Kampf. So, this guy, it was really, you could understand that it was over, but Hitler just refused to admit to any defeat. He even said when they lost these 2 million votes, Hitler just kept driving forward with this all or nothing policy because he said, well, all this means is that we have the truly loyal people with us, and we will prevail. Now, what's interesting, there was in January of 33 this 3-4 week period where everything gets turned on its head, and even Hitler is stunned at the outcome, where suddenly on January 30th, he's appointed chancellor. Completely unexpected. He was as shocked as everybody else was on the political scene. Schleicher was chancellor at that time, and apparently when Schleicher passed Hitler in the chancellery as they were not changing position, as Schleicher was departing and Hitler was coming, and Hitler apparently said to Schleicher, it's always happened to me in my life that whenever even I have given up all hope, I am miraculously saved. And I think this is something that's played itself out again and again. And I think, I don't want to go too far. Well, we will go far ahead, but, going back to that bunker in April of 1945, when the Hitler is holding out to the very end, I think it was a pattern. He was just always assumed that something was going to be there to save him. And thank God it didn't.
Tim, as you've written this, I just want to make sure to reinforce before we go into our last segment, the story of how Hitler rose and became the Führer and unleashed a war that took the lives worldwide of 50 million. It all starts, not its early seeds were way back when, but it is a absolutely pivotal moment in 1932 going into 33, and it is an absolute political drama. It is a stunning political drama that the vast majority of people who are students of World War II and students of Nazi Germany and kind of all that Hitler was and did are unfamiliar with. And this book just does such a good job of explaining the objective facts of what kind of unfolds. So again, I'm plugging your book repeatedly, but I can't commend it enough to people's reading. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. The Person of Hitler. The opening page of Takeover, Adolf Hitler's Final Rise to Power, features an impression from Dorothy Thompson's book, I Saw Hitler. Quote, "When I walked into Adolf Hitler's room, I was convinced that I was meeting the future dictator of Germany. In something like 50 seconds, I was quite sure that I was not. It took just about that time to measure the startling insignificance of this man who had set this world agog." Close quote. Now, Thompson wrote this just 1 year before Adolf Hitler would become the Chancellor of Germany. And yet, as Tim Ryback writes in Takeover, while many observers saw Hitler as indecisive, fanatic, and occasionally unhinged, Harry Kessler, an astute observer of contemporary politics, sensed in 1936 that Hitler knew exactly what he was doing. Hitler's oratory style at political rallies served to distract attention from Hitler's calculated and calibrated manipulation of the moment. What made Hitler so dangerous, Kessler believed, was his bluster, behind which lay, quote, his intuition, lightning-fast ability to assess a situation, and ability to react with astonishing speed and effectiveness, close quote. So, Tim, Harry Kessler warned against underestimating Hitler, whereas Dorothy Thompson insists there was simply nothing to see in the man. And it sort of seems that Churchill's description of Russia might well apply to Hitler, saying that he is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Why is the person of Hitler so endlessly impenetrable? Even to Traudl Junge, who says, with her caveat to you, but how does anybody really know what somebody else believes? Why is Hitler? Why does he draw us in and seem so opaque to even the closest of observations?
Well, it is, Todd. There have been, I think, north of 100,000 biographers who attempt to explain Hitler, over the last 50, 80 years. The man is endlessly complex. I think because of we've rarely seen such. I don't think we've ever seen such acts of such evil in our world. You said there was 50, 60 million people dead. The hatred, the viciousness that he seems to project. And it does, we come at it, there are attempts to explain Hitler through the politics, through the society, through the economics, through the religious. And there's in some ways there's a Hitler for everyone. Whatever you're looking for, you can find it. But I think it's because of the broader resonances of this man and what it is, because you can't look at him without looking at the whole context of of who he was and what the implications were. I'm not sure Dorothy, I'm not sure Dorothy Thompson, well, clearly she got it, really wrong. I actually think that, I think Kessler was on the mark. Let me mention someone else here. His name was Hans Prinzhorn. And Hans Prinzhorn was a psychiatrist who had done a famous book in the early 1920s, one of the first people to look at creativity and insanity. And he did a book about that line between, the creative and the insane. But he was basically analyzing people, but also analyzing society. He himself was not a Nazi. He was just a centrist, just an average German, politically speaking. But he decided to attend a rally of Hitler's in the late 1920s, and he ended up writing a long psychoanalysis of an Adolf Hitler beer hall rally. And what he was struck by was his rhetorical style, which was his voice would rise and rise and rise to a fury, to a fanatic pitch, this raging, and then he would fall silent, and there would be a pause. And then he would continue in a completely rational voice. And what Prinzhorn saw was this: he took his listeners, the audience, on this roller coaster ride of emotions. And he beat a couple of simple tropes. There was the stab in the back. There was the reparations. There were the Jewish conspiracy. And he used a couple of these tropes again and again and again. But what he basically came away with, his analysis, was that Hitler's power lay not in the rational, but in actually touching on the emotional and the irrational. So that when his critics would attack him, the Social Democrats or the Centrist Party or the Bavarian People's Party, they would say his program is hollow. This man, the Dorothy Thompson thing, this guy actually is a hollow man. He has nothing to say. There's nothing to his program. It didn't matter because and this is what Prinzhorn said was, the reason Hitler is sort of this, he didn't use it, what we'd call a Teflon personality. The reason none of this mattered was because Hitler's connection with his audience was at an emotional level rather than at a rational level. And I do think, I don't know to what degree, how much of that was calculated on Hitler's part. I think there was probably, it was a give and take. I mean, Hitler was clearly, first of all, I think he was highly intelligent. I mean, when you hear about people talking, even, the generals who despised him were impressed by Hitler's ability to recall the capacities of various pieces of military equipment or production quotas or on and on and on, just, at the drop of a hat. So I think this man was highly intelligent, but I also think he was highly attuned to, responding to the way audiences were. I think there was sort of an innate fanaticism within him, and it goes, you mentioned this Catholicism earlier. You listen to one of his most famous speeches, which is right after he becomes chancellor, and he ends it on one of these Prinzhorn crescendos where his voice just rises, and all of a sudden, and he ends it with Amen. And I don't necessarily think, when you listen to it, I don't think this is calculated on his part. I think this is part of Hitler's upbringing, his deeper roots coming through and just echoing into his politics. With that said, I would also argue that Hitler was a man of tremendous and deep insecurities. I mentioned earlier his endless readings, his attempt to impress people with what he'd read. Traudl Junge said he would come down every morning. She had breakfast with him every morning. And she said every morning he would come down and she would get an endless lecture about the previous night's reading, what he had done. But I think this was attempting to fill this gap. I also think Hitler was driven by deep insecurities related to his background. Keep in mind who he was. This is Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor, this dictator, but he was not even German. He came from backwoods Austria. And in normal conversation, when he wasn't screaming, you could hear his Austrian, his southern accent coming through, which to a northern German ears, sounds just doesn't have that crispness that a North German sound would have to it. They and keep in mind who he was so here he is. This I should also mention this. When you read Mein Kampf, which is his political autobiography, it's also, he lays out programmatically every nightmare that played out is contained in there. I used to say that the one thing you could say about Hitler was he was the one politician who kept all of his political promises, because the world knew what he got. But what's interesting is when Hitler talks about his childhood and growing up, he mentions his mother, I think like 32 times, his father 28 times. He had 3 siblings, and there's not a single reference to any of his siblings. Now, he writes 3 chapters on his childhood without mentioning his brother or his 2 sisters. And the only place in there is when the father dies, he uses the term unser Vater, which is our father. Instead of saying when my father died, he said when our father dies. His sister Paula, when she read Mein Kampf, she said, my entire existence had been reduced to a personal pronoun. But I think, this is Hitler attempting, and this is, let me tell you where this is going. This is Hitler attempting to shape an image for himself, aware of where he came from, but trying to cover up these roots. There's also this haunting story, which I'm not sure how much it bothered Hitler, but the fact that his father was an illegitimate child, possibly sired with Jewish blood in there. So Hitler could never deliver the Aryan credentials that he was demanding of his millions of followers. But let's go ahead. So this is the man who has made a political career of it, but carrying a lot of these insecurities, a lot of this baggage with him. He becomes chancellor, and he's sitting in a room with a bunch of aristocrats, highly educated people. There's von Papen, there's von Neurath, there's von Crossi, and it goes on and on. There is Hugenberg, one of the wealthiest men in Germany. And here's Hitler, this kid, this 44-year-old guy from backwoods Austria, and everybody knows it. And even when you look at the photographs there, this is a guy who doesn't really quite fit in. And so Hitler was a man out of place. He himself admitted that he did not like Berlin. He was uncomfortable in Berlin. Every chance he got, he went either back to his apartment in Munich or to the Obersalzberg, where the Berghof, where he had his alpine retreat. But so this is, he was a dictator, but he asserted himself and ultimately conquered it. But he was really ultimately always an outsider to this.
Yeah, very good. I also, for the sake of clarity too, Tim, you're Roman Catholic, I'm Catholic. Hitler was a raised Catholic, but he was not a practicing Catholic. And as many people know, the Nazis themselves took over many churches, put a sword on the altar, Mein Kampf on the altar, basically Aryanized things, persecuted, tried to make, concordant with the Catholic Church, and then ultimately went against everything the concordant operated on, persecuted Catholics and so on. So just as you were mentioning that about kind of the amen that was kind of spilling into some of his rhetoric, it was part of, like you said, his formative process in way back from the architecture of Roman Catholicism, that there was some kind of some structural components that carried forward. But is it fair to say this guy he didn't officially abdicate the Catholic faith, but he was clearly not a practitioner? Is that fair to say?
Oh my God, yeah. I'm sorry. No, well, wait.
I know you didn't say that, but I don't. I always know letters will come, and I want to say, we all want to be clear about this.
Let's be absolute clear. I mean, Hitler. Keep in mind, in Dachau, there was an entire barracks just for Catholic priests. One of Hitler's secretaries, Christa Wolf, talked about the fact that once Hitler had taken care of the Jews, the Catholics were going to be next. Or once he got rid of, and the Bolsheviks and the Jews and the Catholics were next in line. So no, this is not a friend who was in any way, quote unquote, a friend of or an associate of Catholic. What's interesting is when you mention, this is another dimension to Hitler that I think if we're talking about his personality, everyone talks about the big lie. Hitler, we have this famous quote, which is, you tell a lie that's big enough and repeat it often enough and everyone will believe it. Well, Hitler did not come to power on the big lie. Hitler came to power on disingenuous promises and a series of little lies. When he got the Christian parties, which was the Center Party and the Bavarian People's Party, to back him on the promise that, and they disagreed with 80% of Hitler's agenda. And they said that to his face. But what he promised them was that the Christian faith would be protected under his government. And so they were willing to accept that 20% and look away from the 80% of things that they did not embrace. And this is where Hitler, piece by piece, I think he made promises to Hindenburg, he made promises to Papen, and there were all of these little pieces where people were willing to disregard the big picture stuff for these small assurances. So when everybody talks about the big lie, to my mind, Hitler came to power not on the big lie, but on a series of small lies.
That's an incredible observation. I've never heard somebody say that, but when you read the story, the Ian Kershaw works, the Joachim Fest works, and the William Shirer works, and so on, you see what you've said is absolutely true. Just it's power by 1,000 paper cuts, if you will, dishonest paper cuts, if you will. I want to ask you, Tim, as Hitler was about to become chancellor, the German nationalist and media magnate Alfred Hugenberg, who you've mentioned before, he chuckled at the attempts to control him, saying they would box him in. And then soon-to-be Vice-Chancellor von Papen insisted, quote, "In 2 months, we'll have pressed Hitler into a corner so tight that he'll squeak," close quote. Historian Jackson Spielvogel observed that, quote, "that others failed to take Hitler and his ideas seriously was one of the greatest advantages over his opponents," close quote. So tell me about the propensity of Hitler's enemies to underestimate him and the intuition Hitler had to outwit them.
Well, keep in mind, Hitler's greatest advantage was, in fact, being underestimated.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, when you look at the cabinet around them, these were all sophisticated businessmen. These were, people with aristocratic titles. These were power players, like someone like von Schleicher, who'd been and Papen, who'd been, playing politics in Berlin all the time. And here comes this Austrian who
Yeah.
had his beer hall political movement, and he ends up in the big city of Berlin. And the assumption was, this is the center of power. We are the power players. And what Hitler did was, he didn't take on the whole thing. He just went after. He's a bit like, the big lie, little lie. It was, he found ways to compromise each of them individually, one bit at a time, and gradually eroded things, or was making promises that he knew he was not going to keep. People possibly assumed he wasn't going to keep them, but you were willing to live with the illusion of that just because it seemed that once again, we had this guy, as you said, as Hugenberg says, as Papen says, in 2 months' time we'll have him in this corner so tight he'll squeak.
Yeah, it's incredible. I only have a couple more questions, Tim. You've been so absolutely generous with your time, so thank you. As we move towards the conclusion of your book in 1932, Hitler has refused to compromise time and again, and not infrequently. You tell us that one of Hitler's favorite quotes is from Frederick the Great, who said, "The commander who throws his last battalion into the battle will be the victor." And in a speech explaining his resistance to compromise, remember, as you've described so well to us, Hitler had opportunities to have lesser positions that might have been a road to power that he refused in July of 32, that he refused in November of 32. He refused again and again, to the dismay of what began to be a splintering of the Nazis, especially Gregor Strasser saying, you're leaving capital on the table, will never effectively rise again if you don't take advantage of this. And Hitler explained his resistance to compromise to a listing Nazi party, saying, "We know our opponents. We know their thinking. When I resisted these temptations to take a position less than chancellor on August 13th and on November 25th, I made the harder and most consequential decisions of my life." And then, Tim, you write in the book, Takeover, quote, "He had never wanted to be considered a statesman. Hitler said, because statesmen were the gravediggers of the people. Hitler was a leader of a movement, not a party, of a Weltanschauung, or a worldview. He would not become beholden to a system. He would never lead his movement into a political trap and would never allow others to do it either. Anyone," Hitler said, "who betrayed the movement, who broke with its discipline and obedience, was from that moment on a dead man." So here we are in November of 1932, and Hitler is saying, "Nope, I want everything. I want the chancellorship. I want the power." My question is, as you're unfolding this, and you know the outcome, but you're living in the present, was this Hitler's and the Nazi Party's moment of truth? He could have compromised that point for a lesser position, and maybe, just maybe, have been marginalized over time out of that position. Was this his moment of truth? Was this his Rubicon, if you will?
Yes, it it shouldn't have been his Rubicon. It should have been the abyss. He should have gone off the cliff, and that would have been the end of it.
Yeah.
But once again, Todd, this is the luck of the devil, the way things worked. What I might mention Kurt von Schleicher here, because Schleicher was chancellor at this. Well, this once again, Hitler. In this November, late November, the party had taken a battering. Gregor Strasser was saying, "Look, let's compromise, let's enter into government, get a foothold, and then build out. And Hitler remained this all or nothing. The point that Schleicher had was, and I think history would have proven this out, seen this out, had Schleicher been given 6 months, the German economy was turning around. Unemployment levels had leveled off. Industry was starting to come back, and had the overall situation was beginning to stabilize. And had Schleicher asked Hindenburg, the president, he said, just give me 6 months and this will stabilize. Had that happened, Hitler had lost 2 million votes in that November election. The party was bankrupt. It was fracturing. You had the Strasse contingent breaking off. And had the party, what you would have seen over the next 6 months is the Weimar Republic stabilizing, the economy stabilizing, the society stabilizing, and the Nazi Party beginning to erode. I wouldn't say disintegrate, but it wouldn't have surprised me if they went down to 25% or 20%. Would have remained a political force, but actually would have been spent. But this became Hitler's Rubicon instead of his instead of the abyss in which he fell. And this was the point when everybody was writing him off, and it was this incredible luck. I will not call it providence or Vorsehung, but it was just this is what Ian Kershaw calls the luck of the devil, that Hitler, that things broke the way they did for him. Now, I don't want to say to Hitler's credit, but what is part of his personality was that this was a man who always doubled down, who never admitted defeat. And Hitler would rather have gone down in ruin rather than compromise. And I think, fast forward to spring of 1945, Hitler took the same approach. Yeah. There was going to be no compromise. There was going to be holding out. The Frederick the Great, throw in the last battalion. Something miraculous has always been there to save me, and something will happen again. And thank God it didn't.
Tim, there was a lot of collapse of Schleicher's capital in January of 1933 that with Hindenburg, that ultimately, if I'm not mistaken, paved the way for Hitler to come to rise to level the chancellor. Is that fair to say? And could you say just a few words about the weeks, just the I don't know, it's a whole drama that everybody's got to read, but the weeks that led to Hitler rising? Was it more of the ignominious fall of Schleicher along with the machinations of Hitler? Was it the doddering kind of fatigue of Hindenburg? Was it pure contingency that led to Hitler kind of finally getting what he was denied all this time? What would you say?
Well, the key figure there is Hindenburg. President, he had the Article 53 powers to appoint or dismiss a chancellor at will. He had, and Schleicher had been his protege, but I think Hindenburg began to weary, because Schleicher was a military guy, was General von Schleicher, but this guy, for him, it wasn't, war is politics by other means. For Schleicher, it was war is politics by other, politics is, war is politics by other means. With Schleicher, it was the other way around. And I think, Hindenburg just got tired of the games that Schleicher was playing. It was always for him. It was always maneuvering. It was always back channeling. It was just the way politics was done. I do not believe that Hindenburg was senile. I mean, you hear this. There's all, at that time. It was. Has Hindenburg lost his mind? Is the guy critically ill? Is he on his way out? When you look once again at meeting protocols in which he is, in which he attended, and you see his questions, this is not a failing mind at all. I do think what had happened was, I think he had wearied of Schleicher. I think he had begun to weary of democracy. He had seen this through since 1926. Keep in mind, Hindenburg had retired in 1914. He
Wow.
went into retirement. The war broke out. He returns to the military to help the country. Okay, he becomes the great field marshal can you win some iconic battles. He sees Germany through. 1918, November, he goes back into retirement. And he's through. He starts writing his memoirs. The country comes into crisis again. So in 1926, he becomes president to save the country. Not that he's any great. He's a closet monarchist. Not that he's any great friend of the Weimar Republic, but he's there for his country, and he adheres to the Constitution, as someone said, the way a field officer adheres to a military manual. I mean, Hindenburg was a man of his word, a man of honor, and if he had sworn an oath to the Constitution, he would do it. He planned to retire after a 7-year term. Hitler decides to run for office. The only reason Hindenburg runs again for a second term is to keep Hitler out of office, so he's running at the age of 84. He gets reelected to another 7-year term, which is essentially for him a death sentence in office. So, this was a man who served his country to the end, but I do fault him in in January and February of 33 for not intervening. A lot of people had faith in Hindenburg that he was going to throw Hitler out of office. People were saying in early February, said Hitler's going to be out at the end of the month. Hindenburg had appointed and dismissed 3 chancellors in the last 8 months. Nothing stopping him from making Hitler the 4th. And ultimately, I am a great fan of Hindenburg for most of his career, but I think at the end of the day, he failed the country, he failed the people, he failed Germany.
Tim, couple questions left. First of all, people are very interested. They're intrigued horrified by this story. And this book of yours, Takeover, again, does such a unbelievable job of giving you the feeling of being in the street, in the meeting rooms, at the decision points of this profoundly decisive year. Who are the historians that you're reading? Who are the people that you would recommend others who want to learn more about Hitler, about his entourage, if you will, about these political movements, behind everything? What books would you recommend, or what historians would you recommend people to read if they want to read more?
Well, I think you've mentioned all of them, and there are hundreds of biographies out there. I think William Shire's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich has really stood the test of time. I think Ian Kershaw's 2-volume, Hubris and Nemesis, 1,600 pages, is magnificent and majestic. I think Joachim Fest has done a superb job. And there's plenty of, great material out there. What I would also recommend, though, is to read a lot of the primary sources, because many of them have been translated into English. You mentioned Harry Kessler. He was this Count Kessler, this man about town in Berlin. He was out on the down in the French Riviera, in Paris at exhibitions, in London, but always back in Berlin when it really mattered, and keeping a daily record. And you can really get a sense of the moment and the events. There's a woman named Bella Frum who also wrote her memoirs. It's in diary form, published in the 1970s. It's called, I think, Blood and Banquets is the title. It just makes for very interesting reading to absorb what was happening at the time. The other thing I might recommend is going to the New York Times archive, which is accessible. It's called New York Times. Anyway, it's their archival thing. You go and you look at there's news reports. My favorite one is the headline on for January 30th, 1933, when they announced that Hitler has become chancellor. The headline is, Hitler gives up claim to being dictator.
Jeez.
Now
Famous
absorb
last
that.
words.
That's the first.
Wow.
That's the first New York. And because the point was, hey, we talked about Hitler always doubling down, saying all or nothing, all or nothing, all or nothing. He wanted a cabinet only with Nazis. In fact, when Hitler accepted this position, Hitler was the chancellor, but Papen was the vice chancellor. Hitler only had 2 cabinet posts there. There are a total of 3 cabinet posts out of this entire group. So he was really compromised. My favorite commentary, even a lot of right-wing fanatics were disappointed that Hitler had agreed to be chancellor instead of dictator. One person commented, "No Third Reich, not even 2.5."
Jeez.
And
Wow.
it was, so it's, how things were. I think the, newspapers at the time is a fascinating way of understanding, how these things moved.
2 last questions, Tim. How have you been changed by writing this book?
Yeah, I guess I realize how unpredictable. People say, in Russia, there's this joke that you think the future is unpredictable. We live in a country where the past is unpredictable. But I guess, I guess, when a lot of people push you to say, oh, this is history, we know history, doesn't repeat itself, but there are resonances, there are this, I guess what I realize is, and I've always resisted drawing a direct line from one historical figure to a contemporary political figure and saying, oh, this person is this person.
Yep.
There are resonances, but nevertheless, you just have no idea. When having forgotten there, I'd studied Nazi Germany for 30 years, but in writing this book, as I told you, I decided to forget everything and just would read what people knew day by day without knowing what was to come. And it's just how unpredictable things can be, how small things can change everything, how some things that seem so dominant and so important actually ultimately in the big picture are forgotten by history. So it's given me it's if the past is uncertain, it makes me even more uncertain about the future, but also in some ways more hopeful, because you really don't know. One wants to add all these things up and say, oh, it's moving in this direction, but we really never know in what direction things will take, what unseen events will be out there.
I wanted to, we talked about this online, but I wanted to commend you, Tim. We live in a day and age where everything has to comment on contemporary strains of this and that. And especially I feel like there are, historians that are increasingly being co-opted or tempted or what have you to be, tell us that this is what's happening again in this, with this party, this person, this group, whatever. You have such an adult in the room approach to your historiography, if you will, that it is just refreshing that you focus in on what happened here as best you can, and you're literally telling it as it unfolds with the press clippings and the minutes and the protocols and so on and so forth. It was so refreshing because I've just seen so much of the politicization of historical commentary that I get tired of it. And all I could, and I'm not saying, it doesn't mean that we all can't look and say, where do we see echoes and rhymes and all these kind of things. But your lesson about the notion of the unpredictability of things. And the second thing is, we have to have humility about what's going on at any time. And we should just say, do we even know what the facts are, even when we reflect back on things? So I just really appreciate you resisted the temptation to have to kind of make a commentary about where we are with either party, any person, what have you, and you focus in on what happened then and say, look at this story, just look at the story and the history behind it. And also recognizing there still is mystery and ineffability and opaqueness that comes in our understanding of the figures of history, the events of history, just as much as are the present events and people right now. Is that a fair way of? I'm complimenting you. I'm asking you if it's fair to compliment you that way, but I know it is. But any reflections on what I just said?
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say is yes, I absolutely. History doesn't repeat itself, as I said earlier, and so I'm very assiduous about not drawing parallels. When there are resonances when I'm writing this, I let them come out. And that's why when you do hear things, but it's not with an intent to say, oh, this is heading in this direction.
Right.
Just saying, oh, this is interesting the way this is. The one lesson that I would take from the past for the present, this is Weimar democracy, this is democracy in America, is it's ultimately the role of every one of us going to the voting booth and casting our vote for the candidate that we want. Whether we like that person or not, whoever ends up being there, this is what living in a democracy is all about. But our second line of defense, and this is, I think, really important. This goes back to our original conversation about, the structure of Weimar Constitution, structure of the American Constitution, the checks and balances. That is, our second line of defense really are the elected representatives that we send either to Congress or to the Reichstag to represent our interests. And probably when you say, what did I learn from all of this? The most disheartening moment for me of the Weimar Republic is on March 3rd, 1933, when Adolf Hitler presents a law he needs in the Reichstag in order to get, it's called an enabling law, which gives him dictatorial powers for 3 years. He needs 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. With his coalition with Hugenberg, they only have 52%. Okay, they do not have a 2/3 majority. So he needs the support of various centrist parties, and you have the centrist party of the Bavarian People's Party. All these other people parties that he needs. They say, Mr. Chancellor Hitler, we are concerned about the hatred that you're spreading in the country. We're concerned about the future of rule of law. We're concerned about the future of civil liberties. We're concerned about the future of democracy itself. But with that said, we're giving you our vote. And you hear one after the other come. And now they were elected by their constituencies to represent them. And they did not serve their constituencies well. They ultimately did not serve the German people well, or the German nation. One commentator at the time called it the mass suicide of political parties.
Wow.
And to my mind, that was the most disheartening moment of Weimar. And it was literally, that's the moment the Weimar Republic truly ended. But I do think it gives me faith in the in the structures of democracy, but I think it's also up to the electorate, we as voters, to hold our elected officials accountable to us, that they act responsibly in our interests, whatever those interests may be. And as I say, I'm willing, I don't necessarily agree with certain political directions or not, but I have enough faith in the structures of the institution, and hope that the elected representatives will do that. And I think whatever uncertainties we're living with now, we're looking ahead toward the midterm elections, and the midterm elections will tell us everything about the future of our country.
Very good. It's a plug to read I mean, again, this is going to be broadcast internationally, but on the American side of things, it's a plug to say, hey, let's read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and recall that a lot of what the founders had said about human nature as it is kind of sort of managed within the scaffolding of a system. It's a push pull, it's a dynamic tension, and it's imperfect. It's hopeful, and we all will continue to do the best that we can. Timothy Ryback, a historian, author, director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague, as well as the author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
So I've been thinking, miles of film, thousands of books, and millions of papers have been dedicated to explore the vexing question, how did Adolf Hitler happen? Some have looked at what happened to Hitler, asserting that Hitler was deformed by an abusive father, a rejection from art school, a period of vagrancy, a loss in the Great War, or even the suicide of a cousin who also happened to be a love interest. Others have emphasized who Hitler was, assigning him clinical diagnoses from narcissism to paranoia, from being a manic depressive to a psychopath. In the morass of theories, though, G.K. Chesterton's contention seems to hold the most truth. Quote, one may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star, close quote. Or in a word, it's complicated. In my practice of medicine, I remind my medical students and residents that we can be guilty of making certain presumptions about our patients. We think the story is open and shut, cause and effect. The patient committed action B because of variable A, case closed. But it often isn't that easy. If I can't look at myself in the mirror every morning and easily explain why, in certain circumstances, I do what I do, then how sure can I be that I can easily explain why my patient does what she does? Again, it's complicated. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be paralyzed or to cease attempts to understand and explain. In Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, Tim Ryback brilliantly unfolds the manifold moving parts that contributed in the final stages to Adolf Hitler's accession to power. How did Adolf Hitler happen? What goes into making him who he was? Everything. Friends and enemies, strengths and weaknesses, world events and local happenings, public perceptions and private understandings, insights and blind spots, capitalized chances and missed opportunities, good and bad timing, good luck and galling misfortune. The sheer volume of factors that impacted Hitler's rise is staggering. Similar to the theme in the film Back to the Future, perhaps one variable inch this way or that would have derailed the quibbling street demagogue from becoming the wicked German Führer. As Catholics, we understand that everything matters when it comes to the calling we answer and the state of our soul. Would Adolf Hitler's life have been different if he spent more time in prayer and with the sacraments, immersed in spiritual reading and undergoing spiritual direction, forgiving more and hating less? Would the state of the world be different if the state of Adolf Hitler's soul were different? I think so. I can't fully explain why Adolf Hitler happened. It is a dark yet fascinating consideration that Tim Ryback's book handles brilliantly. But I think I can venture more successfully into how Hitler might not have happened. To quote Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." And one last thing. To be sure, read Tim Ryback's Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, but also check out Ian Kershaw's 2-volume biography on Hitler, Volume 1, 1889 to 1936, Hubris, and Volume 2, 1936 to 1945, Nemesis, are gripping and comprehensive treatments of not only what happened, but also the cultural and philosophical underpinnings of this malevolent life. To wade deep into the darkness that is Adolf Hitler is daunting, but it reminds us that a life in Christ can rescue us from the path to perdition. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.